I've lived a long and difficult life. My husband was a sailor, and I often didn't see him for long periods. So I practically raised our 4 children alone. I put all my strength and energy into my beloved sons and daughter. My husband died early, and as a sailor's widow, the state provided me with a reasonable amount of money as well as a pension. However, all 3 of my children, in whom I invested everything I could, grew up ungrateful. They believed that I didn't need anything in my old age and took all the money I received, buying only the most essential products: bread, cheese, pasta, grains, milk, butter, fruit, and vegetables. I didn't complain because I truly believed that I needed almost nothing. My children still meant everything to me. Buy something for the grandchildren, I once said when my eldest son, Victor, came to collect money. My children took it in turns to take my savings. Of course. He nodded, getting ready to leave. It's a shame I hardly ever see them. They're in the house, Mom. You know, they're always at school. They don't even have time to go out with their friends. And it's not close for them to come to you? I understand, of course. I live on the outskirts and you live in the center. But sometimes you could bring them, couldn't you? I miss them so much, I admitted, looking pleadingly at my son. Maybe you'll bring them during the vacations if we don't go anywhere, Victor replied rudely, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, got in the car, and drove away. I sighed again. Normally, during the vacations, Victor and his wife and 2 children went abroad. My middle son, Pedro, had no children yet. He and his wife worked constantly, wanting to save money for a new house. My youngest son, Diego, had recently graduated from university and was not yet married. He was actively looking for a job and also needed money. My daughter, Sophia, was studying abroad. She had managed to get into a prestigious foreign university on a scholarship. I rarely saw her, as she didn't have the money to travel home. What's more, she didn't know that her brothers took money from me and often sent me small amounts. I understood that if I told my daughter how her brothers behaved, the children would inevitably fight, so I preferred to remain silent. Family harmony was more important to me. Sophia wrote touching letters, and I eagerly awaited the end of my daughter's university studies, fearing that she would want to stay there. What if she falls in love with someone and gets married, or gets a job offer? Then I'll be all alone. I sighed to myself. I understood that I couldn't count on my children. My daughter was my only hope and support. Sophia wrote that she missed home very much and wanted to see her mother, siblings, and friends as soon as possible, which reassured me a little. I carefully stored my daughter's letters in a beautiful box. My children came to collect money and groceries once a month. On one of their visits, Pedro took the money and rushed to the airport. He had an important business meeting in another city. He said that his assistant would bring the groceries in the morning. However, busy as he was, Pedro completely forgot to tell him. In the morning, I tried to call my son, but the phone was switched off. The eldest son, Victor, and his family had gone to the beach, and the youngest, Diego, had gone to a music festival with his friends. I checked the cupboards and realized there were no more groceries. I wanted to go to my neighbor and ask for something, but she had gone to visit her children. I couldn't think of anything better than going to the square near the market. There, I started asking passersby to buy me some bread. I felt very embarrassed. Many ignored me, others hurried past without listening to what I was saying. I was completely desperate when suddenly an expensive Jeep stopped right in front of me. I recoiled in fear when a well-dressed young man wearing sunglasses jumped out of the car. "Mrs. Martinez," he exclaimed. "Is that really you?" I looked at him in confusion. How did he know my last name? "It's me, Manuel," he introduced himself, taking off his glasses. Only then did I recognize him. "Manuel, it's you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "How you've grown." Manuel hugged me tightly. "What are you doing here?" he asked, noticing the empty bag in my hands. I started to speak but couldn't continue. I was ashamed of begging. "You were probably going to the market to buy groceries," Manuel guessed. "Let's go together. I'll help you buy everything and I'll take you home, so you don't have to carry a heavy bag." With those words, Manuel took my arm and led me to the market. I felt embarrassed. I couldn't let him pay for me and I didn't have any money of my own. "Manuel, I'm sorry. I just realized I forgot my wallet at home," I said softly. Manuel just smiled, without slowing down. No problem, I'll pay for everything. It's trivial, but I'll feel uncomfortable taking your money. Manuel stopped and looked me in the eye. What are you saying, Mrs. Martinez? Didn't you do everything for me before? Didn't you feed me every day as if I were your own son? And after all that, aren't you going to let me buy groceries for you? I took a handkerchief from my pocket and began to wipe away my tears. You're a good boy, thank you, I said, pressing my hands to my heart. I never doubted that he would grow up like this. Come on, we'll buy everything we need and I'll take you home, Manuel repeated, taking my elbow carefully, warning me about the steps and slopes. Arriving at the market, we walked through the rows and Manuel bought the best. Look, the strawberries are already ripe. I remember you like them. But they're so expensive, Manuel, I protested. Not at all, Manuel dismissed. I can buy what you like. I'll be happy to make something nice for you. With bags full of groceries, Manuel loaded everything into the car. I could barely keep up with him. I felt so good inside. We got into the Jeep and Manuel drove confidently through the city streets. Do you remember where I live? I asked. Of course, Mrs. Martinez. I lived next door to you for more than 10 years, Manuel replied, with a tone of sadness in his voice. I nodded. Manuel was the son of my neighbors who lived in the house across the street. They weren't a happy family. They often drank and got into fights. Manuel suffered too. He was scolded and his father often raised his hand against him. The boy would run away from home and hide in my house. I could play with my children all day, and unlike my own children, they always helped me in the kitchen when necessary. Sophia also spent a lot of time with him, while Victor, Pedro, and Diego played in the yard, refusing to come in. Manuel was completely different, caring and attentive. Mrs. Martinez, said the man, bringing me back to my memories. How is Sophia? Is she married yet? I looked at him. He was looking at the road, but I could see that he was anxiously awaiting my answer. She's studying abroad. She applied to university and got a scholarship, I replied proudly. Manuel smiled. I always knew she could do it, he whispered. I nodded, looking at his handsome profile. Manuel was driving without his glasses, and now I could see that his eyes were cloudy, as if he was far away, lost in his memories. He turned on the radio and a soft melody flooded the interior of the car. A retro wave was playing. I closed my eyes and the memories took me back many years. I vividly remembered Manuel as a boy. I always felt sorry for him. When the boy's parents fought, the whole neighborhood knew about their arguments. Manuel, an only child, often bore the brunt of it. He would come to me with bruises. As a child, the boy was clumsy and unusually tall for his age. His unruly black hair stood up in a tuft at the back of his head, no matter how hard he tried to straighten it. Manuel had beautiful hazel eyes, sparkling with vivacity, but sometimes I could clearly see the sadness in them. My children didn't reject the boy. They let him play catch, hide and seek, and other games with them. However, Manuel preferred my company. Sitting in the kitchen next to me and helping with the cooking was his favorite pastime. He diligently rolled out dough for pies, chopped vegetables for soup, mashed boiled potatoes for mashed potatoes. Sophia also hovered constantly in the kitchen, unable to tear herself away from Manuel and me, with whom she formed a special bond from the very first days. They understood each other without words and were very interested in each other. Manuel was naturally curious. He loved astronomy, knew almost all the European capitals, and could spend hours recounting interesting facts he learned at school or in newspapers he found near the neighbor's garbage. Mr. Torres, knowing that the neighbor boy liked to read, would intentionally leave old newspapers for him. Sometimes Manuel would get books, which he read from cover to cover, no matter the genre: novels, science fiction, adventures, or scientific essays. Sophia would listen to Manuel with her mouth open, and I too was sometimes very impressed by his knowledge. My life became bright and interesting with the presence of the neighbor boy. Sophia and I looked forward to Manuel's arrival every day. The boy wore the poorest clothes, a faded t-shirt and worn-out shorts. His sandals, which he never took off, were worn out and Manuel had almost outgrown them. He constantly hurt his toes on objects and I even offered him new shoes, but Manuel just shook his head. I knew his father would immediately take the new pair of sandals and sell them on the market. So I found a solution. In the attic, I stored the boys' old clothes, which they had outgrown. I found a pair of worn-out sneakers that belonged to Pedro and gave them to Manuel. The boy almost jumped for joy when he tried them on. The sneakers were just the right size, and he thanked me sincerely for the gift. At night, I often couldn't sleep, thinking about Manuel's unfortunate fate. My gentle heart ached at the thought of what he had to endure at home. One night before going to sleep, I shared my thoughts with my husband, but he just disregarded my words. "You can't change anything. The boy has parents, but he's unhappy with them. They mistreat him, and his father even wears a belt sometimes. They're still his parents. Besides, even if I wanted to adopt him, we couldn't afford another child. We already have enough mouths to feed in this family," my husband commented sensibly. "But Manuel eats very little," I retorted. "Look how thin he is." "This is a useless conversation." My husband interrupted me and turned away, intending to go to sleep. I sighed. My heart refused to listen to the arguments of reason. I didn't know that another heart in my house was also suffering for Manuel at that time. Sophia was growing up, and I began to notice how she looked at the poor neighbor with her eyes. This didn't bother me much because I knew Manuel was a good boy and would never allow my daughter to be hurt. When Sophia turned 14, I organized a real celebration for her. I baked a cake and decorated it with her favorite strawberries and whipped cream. I also prepared lots of competitions and games for the children, allowing Sophia to invite her classmates and best friends. The girl asked if she could invite Manuel, and I allowed it. On the day of the celebration, Sophia wore a new soft blue dress that I had made myself. I had styled her reddish-brown hair into a beautiful hairstyle and adorned it with flowers and ribbons. Sophia was beyond charming, and her eyes sparkled with happiness. Her father had just returned from a trip and brought her a huge teddy bear with a pink heart on its chest. Sophia hugged the bear and didn't want to let go for a long time. The girl's friends gave her cute trinkets: a mirror in a beautiful mother-of-pearl frame, golden earrings, shell necklaces, and other nice little things. My children also dressed up. They ran around the garden in white shirts with turquoise butterflies and black pleated pants. I cringed every time one of them fell, fearing they would rip their pants. Sophia was anxiously awaiting Manuel's arrival. It was obvious from the glances she cast towards his house. Finally, the boy arrived. He was also dressed. He wore a light blue shirt with short sleeves and slightly short gray pants, the ones he wore to school. In his hands, he held a worn-out book about princesses that he had bought from a bookseller, a bouquet of wild daisies, and a box of chocolates. She couldn't afford more, but Sophia was very happy with Manuel's gift. The celebration was a great success. The children had a great time playing and dancing in the garden. When it got dark, I called everyone inside and turned off the lights. Singing, I solemnly brought out the cake with 14 lighted candles. Sophia made a wish, casting a glance at Manuel, and blew out the flames of the candles. I started cutting the cake and distributing it to the guests, not noticing when my daughter and Manuel disappeared. "Where's Sophia?" asked Diego, the youngest, 10 minutes later. "Why isn't she eating the cake?" For a moment, I felt a twinge of unknown foreboding in my heart, but I paid it no mind. "Go find her, son," I replied. Diego jumped up from the table and ran into the garden. Victor and Pedro followed him, and a few minutes later, the peaceful flow of the celebration was interrupted by shouts, whistles, and curses. Frightened, I ran out into the garden to find out what was going on. Sophia was sitting on the swing with her hands covering her face. Manuel was standing next to her, crestfallen. Diego was crying, and Victor and Pedro were clenching their fists, their faces contorted with rage. "It wasn't his fault," sobbed Sophia. "What happened?" I shouted, feeling my heart squeeze. "Manuel molested her," replied Victor dryly. "That's not true," exclaimed Sophia, pulling her hands away from her flushed face. "We saw everything. You kissed him on the lips," shouted Pedro. Diego cried harder. "What were you doing, Sophia?" My husband exhaled. "You're 3 years older than her," he shouted at the young man. "How dare you? Did you want to seduce her?" Manuel shook his head quickly. "I didn't want to do anything like that. I don't understand how it happened," My husband clenched his fists and his face turned red with anger. "Get out of my house now and never come back." He grabbed him by the collar and dragged him towards the gate. I wrung my hands, begging my husband to calm down, but he heard nothing. He threw Manuel outside like a puppy and slammed the gate shut. "Shame on you," he shouted, turning to me. "It was you. You took a snake into your bosom, you welcomed him, and now he has the gall to approach our daughter." I gathered myself together and said, "Children, go to your rooms. I'll clean up later, but right now I'm going upstairs to talk to Sophia. She's going to tell me what really happened." My husband gave me an angry look. "I don't care what she says," he said. "I've already told her that he'll never set foot in this house again. This is my last word. Period." With those words, he walked into the house. I followed him with a heavy heart and immediately went upstairs to Sophia's room. Behind the door, I heard my daughter crying. I knocked softly and went in. I sat on the edge of the bed and stroked her back. "Sophia," I whispered, "nobody blames you for anything. Just, please, tell me what really happened. Your father thinks Manuel tried to seduce you. Is that true? Please answer, it's very important." Sophia lifted her head from the pillow and sobbed, her eyes wet with tears. "Mom, I'm sorry, she whispered. "It's not your fault. I just love him," I confessed. My mother ran her hand through my hair, fixing a loose strand. "I know," she said, turning to me and holding out the teddy bear my father had given me. "I called Manuel into the garden," I confessed. "I asked him to tell me about the constellations. While he was talking, I couldn't help but look at him lovingly, and then something came over me and I kissed him on the lips. He wanted to walk away, and that's when Diego and the other boys appeared. Diego screamed, and then it all started." Sophia sniffled again, a tear running down her cheek. "Mom, he's not coming back, is he?" she asked with tears in her eyes. "I don't know," I whispered, "but I think everything will be all right. I'll try to talk to your father." "Forgive me," Sophia repeated. "I shouldn't have done that." I hugged her even tighter. "It's all right. You're in love with him after all." He didn't respond to the kiss. Sophia cried harder. I pulled away briefly to look into her eyes. "You're still very young, Sophia. It's too soon to think about love. Manuel is older and understands that." "I know," she replied through tears, "but I can't help it. I love him so much." I didn't know how to help my daughter, so we stayed there, holding each other, until Sophia fell asleep, comforted by her mother's warmth and support. I gently covered her with a blanket, and, turning off the light, left the room. In my own room, I tried once more to talk to my husband, but he remained adamant. With a heavy heart, I went downstairs to clear the table and wash the dishes. The next morning, nothing had changed. My husband remained unyielding, and Sophia wouldn't leave the room. I saw Manuel through the window. His face was pale. He looked at me hopefully, but I shook my head sadly. Manuel nodded and disappeared into his house. A week later, he left, leaving a short letter in my mailbox. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm very sorry that things ended this way. If I could change anything, I would. Please give Sophia my best wishes. I'll never forget your kindness. You were the best thing in my life. Sincerely, Manuel." As I read the letter, I cried. I missed Manuel terribly, his liveliness and his funny stories. Without him, life seemed to have lost some of its colors. I showed the letter to Sophia, who hugged me and cried too. However, there was nothing we could do, and we had to accept the situation as it was. Sophia began to study more. Manuel's departure inspired her to focus on her own education. She now had the dream of enrolling at a foreign university and leaving, just like her beloved Manuel. His image inspired her to new successes and achievements. In the end, everything turned out the way Sophia wanted. I was very happy. Although it was hard for me to let my daughter go, I couldn't help but admit to myself that I loved and cared for Sophia more than anyone else. My boys seemed to live their own lives. It was a shame that my husband was rarely at home and spent little time with the children. Perhaps if he had been there more, they would have grown up to be more noble and decent people. I sighed and came back to the present. What was done was done. The past couldn't be undone. Manuel had already arrived at my house and parked nearby. He helped me out of the car, then took the bags of groceries out of the trunk and carried them into the house. I ran after him to open the door and let him in. When Manuel entered the hallway, he looked around and sighed. Nothing has changed here, not even the smell. The smell of cherry blossoms haunted me at night for so long, he said, sighing again. I missed you too, I admitted. Manuel took the groceries into the kitchen and was about to say goodbye and leave, but I didn't let him. I made him sit down at the table and said, "You're not going anywhere until you've tasted my pancakes. I remember how much you loved them." Manuel laughed. "Okay, Mrs. Martinez, I'm not in a hurry." As I started cooking, I asked, "Tell me about yourself. What has your life been like?" "I've been living splendidly," he replied. "I'm doing what I love most in the world." "What is it?" I asked, taking a pink bowl from the cupboard. "I became a chef," Manuel confessed. "When I left, I enrolled in college in the next town. After my studies, I came back here." "Oh, you always loved helping out in the kitchen," I exclaimed, giving him a happy look. "Yes, you were a great inspiration to me. It was in your kitchen that I discovered my vocation," Manuel admitted. I felt a warmth spread through my heart. I broke some eggs into the bowl, added sugar, and started mixing. "I not only became a chef, but a real chef," Manuel continued, laughing. I smiled. "Is that so?" "Yes," he nodded. "And I work in the best restaurant in town. It's incredibly popular. I've been very lucky." For a moment, I stopped what I was doing, walked over to Manuel, and put my hand on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Manuel," I said with tears in my eyes. He noticed. He got up from his chair and hugged me. "I think you worried about me all the time," he said softly. "But now you know I'm okay." "Yes," I nodded. "Now my heart is at peace." I went back to the pasta, took a frying pan out of the cupboard, and put it on the stove. "I hope being the best chef doesn't stop you from enjoying my pancakes," I said, smiling. "Of course not," laughed Manuel, "especially if they come with strawberry jam." I looked at him and noticed a sudden sadness in his eyes. I followed his gaze and saw him looking at a portrait of Sophia hanging on the wall. "She missed you a lot too," I confessed. Manuel lowered his head. "I'm sorry things turned out this way," he said softly. "I still feel ashamed." "It's not your fault," I replied, shaking my head. I flipped a pancake and gave him a sympathetic look. "All this time, I was afraid you'd think I'd taken advantage of the situation with her, but I'd never do that." "I respected you and her too much," said Manuel. I shook my head again. "I never blamed you for anything, Manuel. Sophia fell in love with you and didn't realize the consequences of her impulsive actions." Manuel sighed deeply. "The point is that Suddenly, I had a revelation. "You loved her too," I exclaimed. "Yes," Manuel admitted. "I planned to wait until she was 18 and then ask for her hand in marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Is that true, Manuel?" "Absolutely," he confessed. "But a lot could change in 4 years. Sophia could become interested in someone else. She was only a child at the time. I understand that." "I understand," I replied, "but I think we were meant to be together. I planned to study and get a good job to support the family." "Well, you did that," I smiled. "But I never started a family," Manuel sighed without raising his eyes. We were silent for a moment, and I sensed that he wanted to tell me something else, something very important. "I still love Sophia," he finally admitted. "I haven't been able to forget her. At night, I often try to imagine how she is now." I took another pancake from the frying pan, turned off the stove, and approached him. "My poor boy," I simply said. I placed a plate of pancakes and a bowl of strawberry jam in front of him, then poured myself a coffee and sat down next to him. But before Manuel could finish his first portion, the doorbell rang. I ran into the hallway. When I opened the door, I couldn't believe my eyes. Sophia was standing on the threshold. "Mom, thank God you're all right," she exclaimed, hugging me. "What are you doing here, darling?" I asked, surprised. My day had been full of surprises, and I still hadn't recovered from the first one, the meeting with Manuel. Seeing my daughter at the door was something I hadn't expected at all. "I've come to see you," she replied indignantly, pushing her bangs out of her face. Mom, can I at least go into the hallway? I felt embarrassed and let her in. Meeting Manuel had helped me forget the desperate situation I'd been in the morning, and now I was struggling to remember that I'd been begging in the square for 3 hours. I never thought my brothers were such dishonest people, said Sophia, throwing her bag on the ground. I lowered my gaze. Do you know everything? I asked in a subdued voice. Thank God, yes, she replied, unbuttoning her coat and hanging it casually on a hook. This morning, I was beside myself. A strange anxiety was tormenting me. I called you a dozen times, but you didn't answer. Then I called Pedro, and he suddenly remembered and let slip that he'd forgotten to leave the groceries for you. He swore he'd call his assistant immediately, but I didn't trust him anymore. I made him transfer his savings and the money for the ticket, and he couldn't refuse. I flew to you on the next flight. I was afraid you were on the verge of despair or already starving. As she said all this, Sophia gestured desperately and wrung her hands, trying to hug me. It was clear that she was really worried. I listened to my daughter, simultaneously feeling a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, pride, shame, joy. I remembered that I had forgotten my phone on the bedside table in the morning. I was so worried about the lack of money and supplies. You're so brave and real, Sophia, I said, hugging her and adding quickly to reassure her. I'm fine. I've been helped. At that word, I hesitated, and gathering my courage, said, I was helped by Manuel. On hearing that name, Sophia went pale. What did you say? Manuel? Yes, Manuel, I replied. He's in the kitchen. Sophia, in a state of shock, searched her bag for a mirror and lipstick. I smiled and said, You look beautiful. She nodded excitedly and followed me into the kitchen. When Manuel saw her, he stood up in astonishment. Without taking his eyes off her, he found her even more beautiful. Sophia also looked at him in silence. Then the ice broke, and they hugged. I missed you so much, Manuel admitted. Me too, replied Sophia shyly. Forgive me for everything. Manuel stroked her hair affectionately. And you forgive me for leaving. Sophia felt like she was about to cry, but luckily I invited them to the table. Why are you standing there? The pancakes have completely cooled down. The young people sat down at the table, and for a moment there was silence in the room. Everyone was nervous. However, a moment later, Manuel started talking about his work and Sophia about her studies, and it seemed that there had been no years of separation. Everything suddenly fell into place. I felt full of strength and joy again. I fried the pancakes with skill, and only one thought worried me. I kept remembering my daughter's bitter words. I never thought my brothers were such dishonest people. Sophia's angry, disappointed voice echoed in my head over and over again. It was as if my daughter sensed my state, and interrupting herself in the middle of a sentence, looked anxiously at me. How long have they been taking your money? Asked Sophia abruptly. I stayed silent. I didn't want to tell the truth. Tell the truth, Mom. Don't hide anything, Sophia insisted. I gave in. It's been almost 4 years since you left, I confessed. What? And you've kept quiet all this time? Sophia stood up as if she intended to run to her brothers at that moment. However, seeing Manuel's confused look, she calmed down a little and sat down again. But Mom, how could you? Why didn't you tell me right away? She asked angrily. I just didn't want to worry you, and I didn't want to fight with your brothers. I tried to justify to my children. But they didn't deserve anything better. How could they treat their own mother like that? Sophia couldn't calm down. She got up again and started walking around the room. Manuel watched her silently, not knowing how to intervene. He could see that they were both emotional, and he didn't want to interfere in the family's affairs. But I didn't really need anything. I had enough with the groceries they bought me. I tried to justify my children again. Mom, don't you understand that this isn't normal? Exclaimed Sophia, frustrated. At this point, I'm the only one who doesn't understand what's going on here. Manuel decided to intervene. He looked questioningly at Sophia and then at me. Sophia sat down at the table and began to explain. My heartless brothers have been taking Mom's savings for 4 years, leaving groceries in exchange, she said. Manuel's eyebrows rose in surprise. What? That's just despicable, he exclaimed angrily, just as Sophia had done a minute ago. That's what I'm saying, confirmed Sophia. I didn't know anything about it. By the way, did they take my money too, Mom? I blushed with embarrassment, and Sophia didn't need an answer to understand everything. They're so... She didn't finish the sentence, not wanting to make me more distressed. Manuel stood up agitated. I'm going to talk to them, he said firmly. They need to understand that treating their mother like this is unacceptable. I took his hand and made him sit down again. Manuel, none of them are in town right now. That's why I was in the market square, trying to beg for bread from passersby, I confessed. The young people exchanged glances. Poor Mama, exclaimed Sophia sympathetically. Mrs. Martinez, why didn't you tell me before? Manuel scolded me. I couldn't, I confessed. I was too embarrassed. I swear that won't happen again, said Manuel angrily, and Sophia nodded resolutely. I didn't know what to think. I certainly appreciated the care and genuine feelings of the two people I loved most, but my heart ached at the thought of my children's lack of compassion. I blamed myself for this. Perhaps I should have talked more about kindness and compassion, setting an example. But had I ever been cruel to anyone? I couldn't remember anything like that. Sophia unexpectedly came over and hugged me. Mom, sit down. I want to talk about something, she said. I obediently sat down, not knowing what to expect from my daughter's words. Sophia sat down next to me and started talking. At my university, I'm highly valued. I've almost finished my degree. They already trust me to give lectures to freshmen. As soon as I get my degree, I'll become an assistant in the department and continue my studies to become a professor. My heart leapt. The news about my daughter made me happy and sad at the same time. My worries were not unfounded. Sophia would be abroad, and I would be condemned to a lonely old age. Sophia noticed that I was pale and quickly took my hand. Mom, calm down. I'm not finished yet. I want to take you with me. You'll like this cozy little town. I looked at my daughter doubtfully. But Sophia, how am I going to move? What's stopping you, darling? She asked. I looked around the kitchen. I'm used to this house. I've lived here for 40 years. Of course, Mom, but you're getting old and you need looking after. Who's going to look after you here? My brothers have already proved they can't. By selling this house, you can buy a very nice place there. Despite my doubts, I suddenly felt my daughter's words touch my heart. Suddenly, I felt like changing something. That's strange. I've never thought about moving before. Crossed my mind. By the way, once you've sold the house, you'll have money left over and can even go on a trip, said Sophia. My head was spinning. I've never traveled anywhere, I confessed. I doubt I'd dare to do something like that. I'll take you wherever you want, Manuel said suddenly, and I won't take your money. Sophia and I looked at him with surprise and admiration, but before we could say anything, Manuel added, And you, Sophia, you're going with us, right? Sophia smiled, feeling the tears return to her eyes. With pleasure, she said. The young people looked into each other's eyes, and I distinctly felt that the bond established between them in childhood had not disappeared. They still loved each other. Suddenly, an unpleasant thought crossed my mind. What about the boys? They won't let me go, I muttered softly. They'll have to accept it, said Sophia firmly. 3 months later, despite my children's protests, I moved in with my daughter. Sophia bought me a cozy little house not far from the forest, where there was a beautiful lake. I was very happy. My daughter visited me every day. One day, she didn't come alone. She brought Manuel in her expensive Jeep. I was so happy to see Manuel that I was speechless. How did you end up here, Manuel? I finally asked. I came to visit, replied Sophia cheerfully, her eyes shining with happiness. I promise to take you wherever you want, laughed Manuel, hugging me tightly. Then he turned to Sophia and added, But as your exams are coming up, we're going to wait a while. For now, I'm going to choose a nice apartment for myself in the city center. What? Sophia was surprised this time. But you said you were only here for a short time. I like this little town. Besides, there's a very good and expensive restaurant here that I've already visited. After looking at my CV, they said they'd be happy to have me as their boss, Manuel explained. Sophia jumped for joy. Really? Wow. Manuel hugged her and unexpectedly kissed her on the lips. Now I'm not going anywhere without you, darling, he whispered. I've been waiting to hear those words, she confessed, returning the kiss. I smiled. When they finally let go, I invited them into the house. I made pancakes again, and the kids immediately threw themselves into them. I watched them as they laughed and smiled at each other, imagining that my fondest dream would come true very soon. I could already see myself sitting in the living room, reading gentle children's stories to my grandchildren. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt absolutely happy that the people closest to me were by my side.